Ethan Walker slammed the leather folder onto the microphone stand, and the sound cracked through the ballroom like a gunshot. 200 guests turned at once. The chandeliers trembled. Music died mid-note. Richard Coleman. Ethan announced, lifting the stack of documents high enough for the entire Crescent Hotel ballroom to see. Tonight is the night you hand over the company. In front of everyone. No more delays. My daughter's wedding reception. Her perfect shimmering dream collapsed in a heartbeat. My name is Richard Coleman, founder of Coleman Freight Lines. And this is how the man my daughter married tried to gut me alive under the glow of wedding chandeliers. 1 hour earlier, I had walked into that same ballroom with Avery's arm threaded through mine, her dress flowing beside me like a river of white silk. She leaned into me, smiling the way only daughters can smile when the world feels safe. I thought I had done well as a father. I thought she was walking into a life built on partnership, respect, love. But beneath my pride, a weight pressed against my ribs, a quiet, familiar warning I kept trying to ignore. At the far end of the room stood Ethan. Slicked back hair, custom tuxedo, smile so wide it was practically carved on. A smile I had seen too many times in boardrooms at fundraising dinners, in the faces of men who believed charm could hide rot. Guests whispered about how confident he was. But confidence is not character. Confidence is a mask. And some masks are glued on. The ballroom glittered chandeliers like constellations, champagne-flowing jazz humming softly from the corner. Avery floated through the crowd, greeting her college friends, glowing, laughing. I tried to focus on her joy. But Ethan moved through the room like he owned every square foot of it, shaking hands, slapping backs, telling jokes just loud enough to command a spotlight. His relatives, businessmen from Houston with eyes like measuring tape, watched me from clusters near the bar. They weren't celebrating. They were assessing. I recognized that look. I'd seen it in acquisition meetings, hostile takeovers, merger negotiations. And I felt my throat tighten. For more than 50 years, I had built Coleman Freight Lines with my own hands. 1 truck, then 2, then fleets moving across the country from dawn to dusk. Thousands of drivers. Millions of miles. My name on every truck. But tonight, I just wanted to be a father. Or at least pretend. During cocktail hour, Ethan approached. His bow tie was already loose, cheeks flushed with champagne. He grabbed my shoulder too hard and leaned in. "Richard," he said, voice low but projecting outward so others could overhear. "We should talk." "This is your wedding, Ethan," I replied. "Talk later. Be with Avery." But his grip tightened. "No. Tonight is perfect." His eyes glinted. "Look around you. Witnesses, Richard. They're all here. Witnesses." That single word slid under my skin like ice. I pulled away, muttering something vague, turning toward Avery's aunts to bury the discomfort. But the seed had been planted. It wouldn't leave. Dinner came. The music brightened. For a while I found my footing again, laughing, speaking, raising a glass for the toast. I talked about Avery's childhood, about Linda, my late wife, about the way she would have cried to see this day. Avery squeezed my hand, eyes shining, and I let myself believe I had overreacted. That maybe Ethan was just nervous. That maybe marriage would soften him. That maybe everything would somehow smooth out. I should have known better. When I finished my toast, Ethan cleared his throat sharply. He stepped forward, glass in one hand, leather folder in the other. The chatter dissolved instantly. 200 faces turned as though pulled by a string. Avery's smile faded, confusion sliding across her features. "Ladies and gentlemen," Ethan began, "thank you for being here to witness the beginning of our new life." Polite applause. Avery tried to smile. I felt something coil in my gut. Ethan lifted his hand for silence. "And what better way to start this marriage," he continued, "than with a gesture of trust and unity, 2 families merging just like our futures." He opened the folder. My stomach dropped. Even from a distance, the formatting was unmistakable. Transfer of ownership, corporate restructuring, Coleman Freight Lines. Ethan turned toward me, his voice loud enough to reach every corner of the ballroom. "Richard," he said, "it's time. Hand over the company. Avery and I are the future." A collective gasp moved through the room like a wave. A waiter froze in place, tray trembling. The jazz band halted mid-song, trumpet note cracking and dying. Avery's hands flew to her mouth. She looked as if someone had ripped the air out of her lungs. I placed my glass down slowly, deliberately. "This is neither the time nor the place, Ethan." He smiled, then a smile so sharp it could cut skin. "On the contrary," he said, taking a step forward, "this is exactly the time. Exactly the place. 200 witnesses. 2 families united. What better moment to pass the torch?" Every eye was on me, judging, waiting. Avery's lips parted, but no words came. Tears shimmered on her lashes. My brothers shifted uncomfortably. Ethan's men nodded in approval, like watching a plan unfold. The air thickened, pressing against my chest until I could barely draw breath. And then I understood. Ethan had orchestrated this. Not for unity, not for family, but for spectacle, for pressure, for humiliation. He wanted me cornered. He wanted me branded as selfish if I refused. He wanted control, and he chose my daughter's wedding night to take it. He miscalculated. I straightened, my jaw locked. No, Ethan. Silence slammed into the room. For a moment, just one, his confidence flickered. Then rage contorted his features. He thrust the papers into the air. "Then say it," he shouted. "Tell your daughter, tell all of us that you would rather cling to your power than give Avery the security she deserves." A murmur rippled through the guests. Words harsh and frantic bounced across the ballroom. Avery stood frozen, tears finally spilling, betrayal cutting through her like glass. And that, on the night meant to be the happiest of her life, was the moment everything cracked. Not just the wedding, not just the family, but the world my daughter thought she was stepping into. It shattered beneath her feet. The hush that followed felt like dust in my mouth as I drew a breath and told him this was not the moment for business, not in front of our families, not on the night that belonged to Avery. I said the company would not be discussed here. I set my glass on the table and kept my voice even, because losing my temper would give him the scene he wanted. Ethan laughed in a way that was not laughter at all. He raised his chin and announced that a man my age had no business steering a modern company. He said Coleman Freight Lines needed young blood and bold leadership, and that I should step aside before I damaged what I built. I felt eyes on my back from every direction. Avery stood a few feet away, her bouquet drooping at her side, a smudge of lipstick on her napkin, her smile gone. I wanted to shield her from it, but the storm was already inside the room. I told him again that tonight was about family, and that any conversation about business would happen at the office with counsel present at a time chosen by the board. I kept my hands open and low, and I did not move toward him. I could see the muscles working in his jaw. When he stepped in close, he said the future was here and now. He said men like me cling to power because they cannot face time. He said I had already lost a step and everyone knew it. I nodded once and told him I had heard him. I said he should sit down with his wife and enjoy the meal the staff had worked all day to prepare. I only told him to put away the papers. He did not put them away. He moved closer past the boundary that decent people honor at a celebration. He said if I would not sign tonight, then I should at least hand over the access keys and the passcodes so he could secure the company in the morning. He said good sons protect their families against reckless elders. He said he would not let Avery live at the mercy of my pride. Someone told him to take it easy. Someone else said this was not right. The hotel manager had appeared near the doors with 2 security men in suits that were too tight in the shoulders. I said one last time that the conversation was over. I said the papers were not valid here. I said he should sit. The word sit was the match. Ethan leaned in his face tight and said, I talked like a man who would rather die than let go. His hand came up fast. I saw it at the last second and tried to turn my head. The slap cracked across my cheekbone and mouth, a white flash tearing through my vision. I landed on my hip and shoulder and the world pinwheeled. The taste of copper filled my mouth. I pressed my palm to the floor and felt the cool stone and the humiliation rising like heat under my skin. Somewhere a woman cried out. A glass shattered. The band leader said something low and the microphone squealed and died. I pushed to my elbow. People had formed a half circle at a polite distance. Two of Avery's friends moved toward me and then stopped, looking over their shoulders. The hotel manager took a small step forward and then a small step back. Avery did not move at first. She stood rooted, both hands clamped around the bouquet as if it were a life ring. She looked from me to Ethan and back again. I wanted to tell her I was fine. I wanted to tell her to breathe. The words did not come. Ethan stood over me with his chest heaving. Then his gaze snapped back to me and hardened. He lifted the papers again and said in a voice that carried that I should sign now before things got worse. He said the company needed decisive action. He said he would take care of Avery and our name for the next 50 years if I would just be reasonable for once in my life. Guests began to murmur in a different way, the tone shifting from shock to judgment. A man from my side of the family stepped forward and told Ethan to back up. A server knelt and offered me a clean napkin. I touched my lip and saw blood bright against the white cloth. I held it there and pushed myself to a sitting position. My hip throbbed in time with my heartbeat. I looked at the napkin. I stood. It was not graceful, but I stood. The room made room for me. My cheek burned and my mouth stung, but my voice when it came was steady. I told the manager that his staff had been excellent. I told the band they could pack up. I told the guests that the reception was over and that I was grateful they came to celebrate my daughter's marriage. Others simply stared. The manager nodded and signaled to his staff. Somewhere in the back, the kitchen doors swung open and shut in quick rhythm as plates that would not be served returned to heat lamps. Ethan shouted that I could not end his reception. He said I could not cancel what I had not paid for. That last part was not true, and it landed wrong in the ears of anyone who knew the truth. He lifted the papers and shook them like a flag. He said the board would hear about this. He said lawyers would be involved by sunrise. He said that if I loved my daughter, I would do the right thing and hand over the company. I turned to Avery. Her mascara had smudged at the corners of her eyes. She looked at me as if asking for a map. I told her with my face that I loved her, and that this was not her fault. She nodded once. She did not cross the space between us, and I did not ask her to. Two of Ethan's friends tried to steady him, but he shook them off and kept talking. He said the words competency and hearing and fiduciary duty. He said the years had worn me down and that the company needed to be protected from sentiment. He tried to sound like a man defending a principle. Security finally eased between us. Hands open, voices low. They asked Ethan to lower his voice and give the room space. They asked me if I needed a medic. I said I just needed the door. I felt very tired and very awake at the same time. I took one more look at Avery. She swallowed hard and nodded again as if she heard a sentence I had not spoken aloud. The hotel manager moved with me, ready to escort. The path to the exit opened as people stepped aside. At the door I turned back once and saw Ethan still waving those papers, voice up again, veins standing in his neck. He was saying he would not be silenced, that he would take what was best for the family, no matter how I tried to stop him. The lobby outside the ballroom was quiet and cool. The air smelled faintly of polished wood and lemon oil. My steps echoed on the tile, a steady pace that felt like reclaiming something I had not realized I had been giving away piece by piece. A bellman glanced up from his stand and then looked away. I pressed a palm to the tender place on my cheek and breathed through my nose until the room steadied. I could still hear the muffled hum of voices behind the doors. The band had stopped. The party had shrunken to a ring of whispers around a single loud man. Somewhere inside that room my daughter stood with her bouquet. I straightened my tie and walked toward the entrance, toward the cool night beyond the glass, toward the street where my car waited in the porte cochere with its engine ticking softly. There are moments when a man understands that the next choice will define the rest of the story. I reached for the handle and stepped into the Texas night. I slid into the driver's seat, the leather cool against my back, and gripped the wheel harder than I meant to. My breath came uneven, ragged, like I had just run a mile instead of walked out of my daughter's wedding. The quiet inside the car only made the chaos in my chest louder. I fumbled for my phone, hands trembling, and found Robert Kane's number. My oldest friend. My attorney for more than 30 years. A man who had walked with me through business wars fiercer than tonight's spectacle. He picked up on the second ring. "Richard," he said, his voice calm, steady like always. "Where are you?" "In my car outside the venue." He tried to humiliate me, Robert, in front of everyone. He demanded I sign over my company like it was a party favor. Silence hummed across the line, then a sigh. If he was willing to do that in front of 200 witnesses, it means one thing. I already knew the answer, but I needed to hear it. What? He's desperate. Desperate men make dangerous moves. The words sank into me heavier than the sting still burning on my cheek. I leaned my head against the steering wheel, eyes closed, but all I saw was Ethan's face, smug and sure, like he had already won. Robert kept talking, his tone sharpening. "You need to call the board tonight, not tomorrow, not Monday, tonight. If Ethan's making plays like this, he's not working alone," somebody whispered in his ear. "Somebody is promising him backing. Backing." The word stabbed deeper. My company, Meridian Capital, wasn't built in a vacuum. I had rivals who would love nothing more than to watch me fall. And if Ethan had aligned with even one of them, the threat wasn't just personal. It was corporate. I gripped the phone tighter. "You're saying he's got help. I'm saying you don't corner a man like that at a wedding unless he thinks he has somewhere safe to land." The dashboard lights glowed faint green, throwing shadows across my hands. I realized I was still bleeding from the split at the corner of my mouth. I wiped it with my sleeve, the fabric coming away dark. Robert's voice softened a notch. "Richard, listen to me. Call an emergency meeting. Get the directors in the room. Tonight. Cut this off before he even knows what's happening." I let the words settle. My company wasn't just numbers and buildings. It was my life's work, the empire I had built with late nights, broken deals, victories clawed from nothing. And tonight, in the glow of wedding candles, my son-in-law had tried to rip it from my hands. My throat tightened. Robert. What if he convinces Avery to side with him? Robert paused before answering. "Then you'll know for certain what you're fighting." The truth in that line stung sharper than the slap had. I nodded to myself, though he couldn't see it. "All right. Get the boardroom ready. We meet in 1 hour." I hung up and tossed the phone onto the passenger seat, staring through the windshield at the quiet Texas night. The stars above Dallas glittered like distant reminders of calmer days, but calm had no place left in me. I turned the key. The engine roared awake. Tires crunched over the gravel as I pulled away from the venue, leaving behind the echo of music that no longer belonged to me. The drive downtown, blurred headlights carving tunnels through the dark. My thoughts spiraled. Ethan's words, his audacity, the silence of the guests, Avery's shocked face. For years I had feared losing her trust. Tonight I wondered if I had already lost it. I pulled up in front of Meridian Capital's headquarters, a glass tower that gleamed even at night as if the building itself refused to sleep. My building, my fortress, and tonight my battlefield. Inside, the security guard rose when he saw me, surprise flashing across his face at the sight of my bruised cheek. "Mr. Coleman, everything all right?" I gave him a short nod. "Call maintenance, have the boardroom lit and ready. I need the directors here in 30 minutes. Tell them it's urgent." "Yes, sir." I strode to the elevator, each step echoing on marble, steadying my resolve. The mirrored walls of the lift caught my reflection, a 66-year-old man with blood on his collar and fury in his eyes. a man underestimated, a man not finished. The doors slid open onto the top floor. The boardroom stretched before me, long oak table polished to a sheen, leather chairs waiting like soldiers. I stood at the head, the seat I had claimed for decades, and ran my hand along the wood. It felt cool, solid, mine. One by one the directors arrived, faces drawn with curiosity, some with concern. Murmurs spread at the sight of me. I didn't wait for the noise to settle. "Gentlemen, ladies, we have a problem." I told them plain and unvarnished about Ethan's outburst, about the demand, about the slap heard by 200 witnesses. The room stiffened. A few gasps broke the air. "He's trying to seize control," I said, my voice cutting sharp. "He thinks he can leverage family ties into corporate power. I will not allow it." Robert, seated 2 chairs down, leaned forward. "Which is why we're here tonight. We need to lock down the company before this escalates further. Emergency resolutions, share transfer restrictions, reinforce Richard's position as sole majority shareholder." The directors shifted, exchanging looks, but one by one they nodded. I saw loyalty in their eyes. And more than loyalty, fear. Because if Ethan could do this to me, he could do it to any of them. Robert laid papers on the table, his pen already moving. "You'll sign here, Richard. Tonight we make it airtight." I took the pen. My hand shook for only a second before it steadied. The ink flowed across the page, black and permanent. A line drawn not just on paper but in blood and resolve. When the last signature was done, the weight on my chest loosened. For the first time since the slap, I breathed fully. I looked around the table, meeting every eye. Tonight he tried to take from me, from us. But understand this: Meridian Capital does not bend. Not to rivals, not to opportunists, and not to family who mistake kindness for weakness. The room was silent. Then Robert spoke, voice calm but firm. "It's settled then. The company stands secure." I leaned back in my chair, exhaustion pressing at the edges of me, but beneath it all a fire burned hotter. Tonight Ethan thought he had humiliated me. Instead, he had declared war. I rose, pushing the chair back. "Gentlemen, ladies, we are finished here." As I left the boardroom, the city stretched below, lights glittering in the distance. Dallas was wide awake, and so was I. This was no longer about embarrassment at a wedding. This was survival. This was legacy. This was revenge waiting for its hour. And I had just begun the countdown. The building emptied around me by the time I reached my office. My cheeks still burned. The sting kept me in the present, but the weight on my chest pulled me backward to the year everything I had built began to crack. 2012 was the year the numbers stopped behaving. Freight volumes dipped and stayed down. Diesel did the opposite. A contract I had counted on was awarded to a competitor 2 states over. I had walked through down cycles before, but not with Linda sitting in a recliner at Baylor in Dallas, a blanket over her knees, a thin smile rehearsed for my benefit. I told her we would be fine. I told myself the same. I worked in the office until midnight and then brought the office to her bedside. The bank called a meeting in February. He said the company needed fresh capital. He said the line could not be extended on current terms. When I asked what terms would work, he looked at the senior officer and waited. By March, I was choosing between invoices. Pay the diesel suppliers now and buy time, or pay the note and hope the suppliers forgave a month of delay. Vendors who had sent me Christmas cards started sending past due notices. Robert was the first to say the word partner. He said I should consider bringing in an investor. I told him I did not take on partners. I told him pride was the only thing keeping the doors open. Then he set a card on my desk with a name I had heard before and never dialed. Meridian Capital. I did not call them for a week. When I finally did, they answered on the first ring. Susan McCarthy listened more than she spoke. David Nguyen did the opposite. They knew my roots and my rates and my debt stack without looking at notes. When I said I was not interested in surrender, Susan said she was not offering surrender. Their proposal was that they would take a controlling stake and inject capital to steady the company and refinance the debt. I would remain as chief executive. I would retain 10% equity. In return, I would share control and accept oversight. I asked for a week. They offered me 3 days. That night, I drove from the hospital to the yard and walked the rows of tractors under the floodlights. I ran a palm along a hood and felt the tack of road grit on paint. I remembered the first truck I ever bought, a used cab that sounded like a coffee can of bolts, and the way Linda laughed when the horn stuck on for 5 minutes in front of our first apartment. I thought about the men who had driven for me through blizzards in Kansas and through monsoon rains on the Gulf. I thought about my daughter asleep in a dorm room across town, her head full of marketing plans and the future she believed would arrive on schedule. I signed with Meridian the next morning. The pen moved fast and then slow, as if my hand understood better than my brain that every signature was a small surrender. After Susan shook my hand with both of hers, David outlined a plan: new fuel contracts, new maintenance schedules, a temporary pause on growth routes that had been costing us money dressed up as expansion. The bank called me Mr. Coleman again that afternoon. By April, payables had shrunk to numbers that did not look like punishments. By summer, drivers were taking checks to the bank without holding their breath. My ego did not love any of it. My company had a new heartbeat, and it did not beat only to my drum. I sat in board meetings where I was the least calm person at the table. I learned to explain instead of declare. I learned that being right was not the same as being persuasive. I learned that sometimes control is a myth a man tells himself to sleep at night. Avery did not know. She saw me working and smiling in the pictures I sent and assumed the calm meant victory. I let her assume it. She had exams and internships and a life that did not need my storms. I told myself I would explain after graduation when there was time and less fear in my bones. Then she moved to Austin for her first job, and I told myself I would explain when we were not eating takeout in cardboard boxes on the floor of her new apartment, because that felt like a celebration and not the moment for corporate anatomy. I made an appointment in my mind to tell her on a bright day when the sky would not make the conversation heavier. Bright days came and went. I waited for perfect. Perfect never arrived. In 2015, Linda died. Grief is a solvent. It dissolved parts of me that held other parts together. The few times I tried to raise the subject with Avery, the words came wrapped in the ache of that year, and I could not bear to add one more weight to a daughter who was already carrying more than her frame suggested. I told myself that time would do what time always does. It would smooth the edges. Then 2016 arrived, and I was still telling myself stories about time. Meridian never pretended we were something we were not. They were the majority owners. They were patient and demanding in equal measure. They paid for new dispatch software and insisted on training until every night operator could run the system with one hand. When I drifted toward old habits, Susan would listen and then ask 2 questions I did not want to answer, and I would adjust. When I made a call that worked, David gave credit in front of the full board, and I felt 10 feet tall. When I made a call that did not, he asked for data and Plan B and Plan C, and never once called me old. Years passed, and the company grew leaner and smarter. My 10% felt like a badge I wore for work I was still doing rather than a souvenir from a race already run. The pride I kept was not the old kind. It was the kind that watches a driver buy his second house and knows he did it because our routes got better and our trucks broke down less. Tonight, all of that lay under the bruise on my cheek. Ethan had not just insulted me. He had insulted an arrangement that saved the payroll that paid for the food at his wedding. He had demanded I hand over control I did not own to give. He had demanded a torch that was never mine to pass. I sat back and looked at the ceiling. The office light buzzed softly. Across the room, a photo of Linda at White Rock Lake caught a sliver of neon and sent it back in a thin blue line. I let out the breath I had been holding for more than a decade. The worst mistake was not signing with Meridian. The worst mistake was not telling my daughter why I did. Morning found me in a narrow seat on the first flight out of Dallas. Robert had booked it while I was still in the boardroom. Houston's air felt thicker when I stepped onto the jetway. Robert met me at the curb with a car. We drove in silence. Meridian kept the floor in a midtown tower. They were already there. Susan McCarthy at the head, David and Gwen with a tablet. Thomas Reed stood by the window. I took my place at the far end, set the ice aside, and spoke before anyone could soften the edges. I told them what happened at the wedding, the demand for signatures, the accusation that I was too old for the job, the slap that turned the room to stone. I kept it clean and left nothing out. David said he had news. Ethan Walker owed a little over $200,000 to a mess of creditors. Credit cards, a personal loan from a private lender in Conroe, a balance with a car dealership that had been kicked to collections. He had been sued by his ex-wife Emily in Tarrant County 3 years earlier for fraud and emotional distress and had settled without admission. He had worked at a real estate development firm for 18 months and left during an internal audit that found expenses charged to client codes for work not performed. No criminal charges filed yet, but notes in the audit suggested referrals had been discussed. He said this was a pattern. He said last night was not the beginning. It was the point at which he ran out of road. It was not relief. It was confirmation. The ugly kind that hardens your spine because it must. Susan asked if I believed Avery knew any of this. I told her I did not. My daughter never learned to see around corners for danger because I spent my life moving the corners for her. Thomas said we could not ignore the optics. He said a public scene at a wedding made us look weak and unprepared. He said, age is not a crime, but fatigue is, and the market does not reward fatigue. He finally turned and looked straight at me. He said perhaps it was time to discuss succession in a real way. He said shareholders expect leadership that matches the demands of the day. I let his words hang an inch from my face and did not blink. I asked Thomas to be plain. He said he had received a message last week through a mutual acquaintance. Ethan wanted a meeting. He wanted to talk about a smooth transition. He had ideas about an advisory council. He had ideas about a role for Thomas, a more expansive role. Thomas added that he had not agreed to anything. He said he found it inappropriate and was bringing it to the board now for transparency. Susan asked the name of the mutual acquaintance. Thomas gave it. David asked if there had been any exchange of funds. Thomas said no. He said he would never take money to do what was already in the best interest of the company. I said that last night was not a referendum on my pulse. It was a test of our backbone. I said a man married into my family and tried to convert a toast into a hostile grab. If anyone here thought the correct lesson was that I was tired, they had not been listening. Susan lifted a hand and the room eased a notch. She asked David to outline steps. He did it like a man reading from a checklist in a cockpit. Freeze any pending access changes and operations. Rotate building and system passcodes. Place interim restrictions on document transfers and device access until audit logs could be reviewed. Notify banks that no new signatories were to be added without board approval. Draft a letter to employees that affirmed continuity and condemned violence without naming names. Prepare a brief for outside counsel on potential protective orders and civil exposure. Robert added that we would need to secure statements from wedding guests as soon as possible before stories got colored by gossip. He said a physician should document my injuries today. He said a press line should be set that allowed Avery privacy while cutting off speculation that might drag her into headlines as collateral. Thomas said we were overreacting. He said to imagine how the headlines would read. Wealthy firm crushes young entrepreneur for asking hard questions. I smiled then. I told him Ethan was not a young entrepreneur. He was a man with a file thick enough to hold the day's mail. He had not asked hard questions. He had staged a circus. And the first rule of a circus is that you do not let the animals drive the trucks. Susan asked Thomas if he wished to recuse himself from votes concerning management until the inquiry into his contact with Ethan was complete. Thomas said recusal was unnecessary since no agreement had been made. Susan looked at the other directors. One said recusal would protect everyone. Another nodded slowly. Thomas glanced at the window. Then he sank back into his chair and said he would abstain where appropriate. The meeting moved forward like a train that finds traction after slipping. Documents were reviewed and approved. Messages drafted. Points of contact assigned. I signed where they pointed and spoke only when needed. The ache in my cheek had dulled to a throb. I welcomed it. Pain has a way of keeping a man honest. When we finished, Susan asked me to stay a moment. The others filed out, even Robert, who gave me a look that said we would speak in the hall. She stood and walked to the window. She said this would get harder before it got easier. She said people would choose sides for reasons that had nothing to do with right or wrong. She said I needed to think of Avery not only as my daughter, but as a stakeholder whose trust we would have to win back with facts. I told her facts I could provide. She said then provide them without pride. I told her pride was a hard habit to break. She said so was denial, and then turned and gave me a small nod that held more care than it looked. David stepped back in with a folder and set it on the table. He said inside were the first affidavits from guests who saw Ethan strike me, names and phone numbers. He said he had already spoken to a few, and their accounts were consistent. He said he would build the record quickly. I thanked him. The words felt insufficient, but thanks and action are the only currencies that matter in times like this. In the hallway, Robert was waiting. He asked how bad Thomas's situation felt to me. I told him I did not know yet whether Thomas had leaned toward Ethan out of ambition or out of fear. Either way, leaning was leaning. Robert said he would keep eyes on him and quietly check the acquaintance who brokered the message. I said to do it fast and do it clean. By late morning, the floor had settled into the rhythm of purposeful work. Calls went out. Replies came back. The machine that keeps companies from falling apart when people do had found its hum. I stood at the window for a minute and watched clouds slide over the city like ships with nothing to declare. My phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number told me to call when I could. It included a name I had not seen in years. Emily Walker. I stared at the letters until they meant what they meant. Then I slid the phone into my pocket and drew a slow breath. Susan passed by with a file and paused. She told me we were scheduled to reconvene after lunch. I nodded and said I would be ready. She held my eyes a second longer than necessary and then moved on. The corridor smelled faintly of coffee and toner. The bruise on my cheek had gone from hot to heavy. Somewhere inside the building, a printer sang its small mechanical song. I rubbed the knuckles of my right hand against my palm. There are moments when a man learns who sits with him when the table shakes. This morning had already taught me more than I wanted to know. I straightened my tie and headed back toward the conference room, ready to turn the next page whether it wanted to be turned or not. I pushed the conference room door open. Robert was already seated. Susan and David were reviewing a stack of papers, and the empty chair at the far end waited. I took my seat and set my phone face down on the table. Ethan's name appeared on the screen. Then I opened the voicemail and let it play. He said he wanted to clear the air. He said last night had been unfortunate. He said I had become agitated and that I had lost control and struck him and then stumbled. He said everyone saw it. He said he did not want to escalate, but that he would if I left him no choice. He said words like competency and hearing and fiduciary responsibility. He ended by telling me to do the right thing for Avery and to hand over control before the board forced the issue. David said he had recorded the playback for the record. Robert told me to save the message and forward the audio to legal. I said he was building a story. David nodded and said he was not only building a story, he was telegraphing pressure points. A text from the unknown number appeared. She wrote that what I had seen last night was not new. I told the room I needed a moment to call her. Susan said we would all hear it together. She said she had been married to Ethan until 3 years ago. She said he had charmed her parents, then turned and tried to separate her from them. She said he had insisted on handling family finances, called it efficiency, and then moved money through accounts like a man bailing water from a boat with holes in the bottom. She said he had shouted in public to force silence in private. She said he had once chosen a family gathering to accuse her father of stealing from his own company so he could push a change in signatures. She said it sounded familiar because last night sounded like a replay. I asked if she had proof. She said she did. She said she had screenshots of gambling losses tied to his card at a casino near Lake Charles. She said there were statements that showed cash advances followed by transfers into accounts with names that did not belong to her family. She said there was a mediated settlement from the divorce that never reached the police because she had wanted out more than she had wanted war. She said she had been wrong about that. She asked if my daughter was all right. I told her Avery was not all right, but that she would be. Emily said she would send everything she had. She said she would sign a sworn statement. She said she was sorry she had waited until a stranger was hurt to do what she should have done when she left. I told her a person gets to safety however they can, and that she was doing the right thing now. Files began to land in my inbox. PDFs, photos, scans of letters from collectors, a copy of a civil docket sheet from Tarrant County with his name and hers and a case number. David opened each file, eyes tracking fast. He sent them to Robert and the general counsel. "This is a pattern," he said, "not an incident." He looked at Susan and then at me. He said we should move from defense to capture. Susan asked what capture meant. David said we needed Ethan on record making demands and tying those demands to false claims. He said Texas allows one party to record. He said the cleanest path would be to invite Ethan to a conversation where he believed he was winning and to let him narrate his plan. Robert said we could stage a meeting in a neutral office with counsel present in the next 24 hours. He said we would control the room, the seating, the devices. He said we should consider security in the hall not visible but near. He said before the meeting we would send a message from me that suggested I was open to discussing a transition if certain assurances were made for Avery and for my name. He said that language would bring Ethan running. Susan asked what I thought. I said I wanted him stopped. I said I wanted him to stop in a way that did not require my daughter to testify against her husband in a courtroom. I said a record was our best shield. Thomas had slipped into a chair near the end of the table while we were on the call. He cleared his throat and said this felt like a lot for the company to handle. He said perhaps we should consider a quieter exit for me to avoid a public spectacle. He said he was thinking of the brand. Susan turned her head and said the brand did not benefit from abandoning the truth. David began to lay out steps. He said I should reply to Ethan's voicemail by text to keep his replies in writing. He said I should suggest a time that afternoon to meet at our outside counsel's office on Louisiana Street. He said I should say I wanted to make sure Avery was protected and that the company's obligations were secure. He said in the meantime we would file for a temporary order to protect me from further contact. He said I should visit a clinic 2 blocks over to document the injury. Robert wrote the message on a legal pad and slid it to me. It was simple and left room for Ethan to fill the void with his own ambition. I typed it into my phone and pressed send. The message landed full of the confidence he wore like a suit. He said he appreciated my willingness to be reasonable. He said he would bring the necessary documents. He said we could keep the lawyers to a minimum if I preferred. He said he trusted me to do what was best for the family. He ended with a line that praised my legacy. David saved the message and nodded. He said the hook was set. Susan told Robert to coordinate with counsel and with building security. She told me to go to the clinic, then come back to the office to review the plan one more time before we walked into the meeting. I stood, and the room stood with me. There was no applause, no speeches, just the sound of chairs moving and papers sliding into folders. In the hall, the floor buzzed with a current I could feel through my shoes. Robert matched my stride toward the elevator. He said he would meet me back in this room in an hour. He said we would be ready. I told him I believed him. The elevator doors closed and my reflection looked back at me, a man with a bruise and a plan. The doors opened on the lobby and the cool air reached up. Outside, Houston moved the way cities move when they have outgrown their maps. I stepped into the morning light and headed toward the clinic 2 blocks down, my phone heavier in my pocket, the path ahead straight enough for now. The clinic smelled like rubbing alcohol and fresh paint. A doctor said the swelling would sharpen before it faded. He said he would file his report today and that I could pick up certified copies at the desk before noon. By the time I reached Meridian, Robert met me at the elevator and handed me a manila envelope. He said the council on Louisiana Street had offered their conference room, but Ethan replied that a show of good faith meant meeting at the company home. I told Robert that home was fine. David and Susan were already in the boardroom, a small device with a red light tucked near the end of the table, a second recorder inside a leather portfolio at my seat. I took my chair and stacked the medical documents in front of me. Ethan was in the lobby. I let my hands flatten on the table and watched the glass doors open. "Thank you for seeing me," he said to the room, then looked only at me. "I appreciate your willingness to be reasonable, Richard. Last night was unfortunate. We can correct course now." I told him to sit. He opened the folder and slid across a stack of documents bound with a blue clip. Transfer of voting rights. Interim management authority. "These will make the next steps easy," he said, voice smooth. "The buyer wants to move quickly. They see value in the Coleman network, especially the routes along the Gulf. The offer is $45 million for assets and goodwill. Outstanding liabilities will be addressed in a side letter." He paused and smiled as if remembering an afterthought. "I will receive a fee for bringing the parties together. $500,000 paid at closing." David sat very still, pen poised above his pad without moving. Susan watched Ethan as if measuring a load against an axle. I reached to my portfolio and pressed the small switch inside by touch. I folded my hands on the table and spoke in a voice that did not have to be loud to be heard. "Is this how you care for my daughter, the woman her mother entrusted to me by chopping up the company that paid for the flowers at your wedding and taking a fee to hand it to a rival?" For a heartbeat, Ethan lost his balance. He said I was making it dramatic. He said this was a strategic exit, not a chop shop. He said the brand would survive under new stewardship and that I could retain an honorary title. He said Avery would be grateful to be free of risk. He said his fee was compensation for months of work and that smart men are not ashamed to be paid. Then I asked how many months he had been working. He said long enough to know what was best. I asked which rival had offered the $45 million. He said confidentiality prevented him from naming them until non-disclosure paperwork was signed, but that they were based in San Antonio with a large cold chain footprint. I asked if he had a letter of intent. The font was familiar. The signature line carried initials from someone at a firm I knew only by rumor and caution. David leaned in slightly. He asked whether the fee agreement was with the rival or with Ethan personally. Ethan said it was customary to handle such details between gentlemen. David nodded as if the answer made sense. Susan asked when he had first contacted their counsel. Ethan said counsel sometimes follows the deal rather than leads it. I asked why he thought he had authority to negotiate any sale of any part of this company. His jaw tightened. He said families decide these things. He said paperwork can follow. He said we were all on the same team and that no one here wanted a messy spectacle. The room grew still enough to hear the whisper of the air vent. In that silence I could hear Linda humming to Avery as a baby, a tune without words, something steady and warm. "You struck me at my daughter's wedding," I said. "You left a bruise on a face that she has looked at for 32 years to know what home means. You are sitting in a building paid for by the trucks of men who missed Christmas mornings to deliver milk, steel, glass medicine. You believe you can sell those miles for a fee and call it care." He opened his mouth and nothing came out. Then he found a thread. He said he was protecting Avery from my decline, that he could not stand by while I put her future at risk, that he had seen me forget details and repeat stories. He said last night was proof that my temper no longer respected rooms. He said this transfer was an act of mercy dressed as business. Robert slid the clinic photos onto the table as if setting down cards in a quiet game. Ethan looked at them and then at me, and for a second the mask slipped again. David asked if Ethan would mind repeating the terms of his fee so our notes were accurate. Ethan straightened, invited by the attention. He said the amount again, crisp, as if reading from an invoice in his head. He said it was tied to closing, and that a bridge payment had been discussed to carry him through the interim. Robert asked who had discussed the bridge. Ethan hesitated and then said, representatives of the buyer. He did not offer names. Susan asked what provisions he had made for the drivers. He said market rates would be honored, where practical. She asked about dispatch staff. He said efficiencies would be found. She asked about the shops. He said some would close, some would be consolidated. It was all standard. My throat tightened. I pictured the shop in Tyler, where an old mechanic named Leon had taught younger men to listen to an engine with their fingertips. I pictured the dispatch desk in Beaumont, where a woman named Ray kept a basket of peppermints and a photo of her son in a Marine uniform. I pictured the barbecue we held every June, where drivers told stories that made no sense unless you had watched dawn from the cab of a tractor heading east on a long, flat road. I asked Ethan why $500,000. He said it was a fair rate for a deal of this size and complexity. I asked how much of that would go to the debts David had already found in his file. He went very still and then smiled. He said personal matters were not the business of the board. He said he would be a steward of the transition. Robert cleared his throat. He said the board would need time to review the documents and verify the representations. He said we would reach out to the buyer directly through counsel to confirm the legitimacy of the offer. He said no transfer of authority was on the table today. Ethan bristled. He said delay would kill the deal. He said windows close. He said a man who hesitates loses. He said if we stalled, he would have no choice but to initiate steps to protect Avery from what he called my decline. I leaned forward just enough to let him feel the weight of my attention. There is no decline here, I said. There is documentation. There is counsel. There is security. There is a board with a memory long enough to remember men who promise shortcuts. You will not bulldoze this room. He tried to hold my gaze and could not. He gathered the papers with sharp motions, then left the letter of intent where it lay, perhaps to prove he had something to leave behind. He said he expected a response by evening. He said he would make a few calls to keep the buyer warm. Susan thanked him for coming. David clicked the recorder off. Robert slid the clinic report back into the envelope. Ethan walked to the door and paused. No one did. He nodded to no one and left. The door closed softly. The room exhaled. Outside the window, a bank of clouds moved in from the south, tall and white at the top. Gray at the base, a weather front deciding what it wanted to be. I sat very still and listened to the hum in the walls, and to the quiet relief in my own chest that comes when a man sees the enemy he is fighting without the need to pretend he is family. David glanced at his screen, then handed it to Susan without a word. A shaky video filled the display, the ballroom bright and glittering, a crowd leaning in my face at the center like a target. There was the raise of Ethan's hand, the white crack of contact, my shoulder tipping the marble rushing up. Comments were already stacking beneath it. Strangers arguing with each other as if the truth were a chair they could drag to their side. Robert's phone chimed next. This one from near the cake frosting, and flowers blurred at the edge as the camera swung. She said this will not stay quiet. David agreed. He said we needed to assume it would hit every local station by evening. My screen lit with a number I did not know. The message said she was Patricia Young from the Dallas Herald. She wrote that she had the video and 3 statements from guests. She wanted to speak with me on the record. She offered to meet anywhere I chose. She said the paper would run with or without my voice, but preferred to have it. I read it twice and felt my throat tighten. I had never been on one like this. He said a line I have heard him use in board fights when the facts favored us and the wind did not. Public pressure is our best leverage. She said silence would let others define the frame. Our job was to protect the company and by extension the people whose lives were tied to it. She said a clear statement would anchor the swirl. I told them I did not want Avery dragged into a headline. Robert said then, make that part of the conditions. He said we would give the paper dates, facts, and documentation, and one short statement from me. He said we would ask them not to print where Avery was or quote anyone who speculated on her mental state. He said good reporters understand the line between public interest and cruelty. Patricia wrote again, this time asking for 10 minutes by phone. I stepped into a smaller conference room and hit call. She said she had seen 2 videos and had verified the time and place with hotel staff. She said she had listed witnesses who were willing to go on the record about the strike and the demand for corporate papers. She asked me to confirm I had been treated for injury and whether a report had been filed. I told her I had been seen at a clinic and that the photographs were available for inspection. I said a report would be filed after counsel finished compiling statements. She asked if I would like to add any context. I told her I would provide a brief statement, but would not comment on my daughter. The pause that followed told me she understood. I returned to the boardroom and laid out the details. Robert drafted the sentence on his pad. It condemned violence in a family setting and affirmed that the company would continue operations as normal. It said we were cooperating with authorities and securing every legal protection available. It did not use Ethan's name. It only stood on what could be proved before sundown. I read the line and felt a small steadiness return. I sent it to Patricia with the clinic report and contact numbers for 2 guests who had already agreed to speak. I included the voicemail Ethan had left routed through counsel, so it carried the proper chain. Patricia replied that the paper would push an online story within the hour, an update for print late. She wrote that she appreciated the clarity and that she would handle the piece with care. David worked his own channels, calling a producer at a station he trusted. Susan contacted our communications team and had them prepare a memo for employees that acknowledged the incident and reminded everyone to route media inquiries through a single address. In a trucking company, the wheels must turn. It is rent and mortgage and school and groceries. My phone buzzed with names of cousins and old friends. I let each call slide to voicemail. In the corner of the room, the television was muted captions flicking under footage of the hotel's entrance. The crawl at the bottom used my name and a phrase I did not like. Alleged assault at wedding. Patricia's number appeared again. She said they were adding a second paragraph based on new video that captured Ethan's words when he demanded control. She read the phrasing back to confirm I did not dispute it. I told her I did not. She said they would run a sidebar explaining Texas law regarding battery against an elder. She said the piece would avoid naming Avery's location. She said they had reached out to Ethan for comment and had not yet received a reply. She thanked me for the documents. For a stretch, the room hummed with work. Robert and David coordinated with counsel for the meeting on Louisiana Street, even though we suspected Ethan would push to keep everything on friendly turf. Susan reviewed language for suppliers and banks, a calm assurance that bills were paid, loads were moving, and leadership was in control. I stared at the skyline and thought of the men and women whose days would be measured by schedules and miles while mine was measured by headlines. A notification blinked on my screen. Dallas Herald updated its homepage. The banner at the top was blunt in its economy. Son-in-law assaults trucking CEO, father-in-law at wedding. Beside the headline ran a still from the clearest video, my body bent at the waist, Ethan's hand midair, a woman's shocked face in the foreground. I kept looking at the woman because it was not Avery. It was a stranger who happened to be in the path of a moment that would follow us all for years. The article moved fast through the facts. It listed the time and place, the guest count as estimated by the hotel, the request for corporate papers made in a public setting, the strike, the medical photographs verified by the clinic, the simple statement I had offered, and the non-response from Ethan. It included a paragraph describing the mission of our company in language I had used in a speech a decade ago about moving America forward, one load at a time. I did not remember speaking those words, but Robert read over my shoulder and exhaled. He said this would box Ethan in. If he denied, the video would answer. If he stayed silent, the headline would stand. If he tried to counter with a story about my decline, the clinic report and the timeline would cut it down. He said a man who steps into a storm like this usually tries to make lightning with his mouth. He said we only had to keep the ground steady. Texts began to roll in from drivers and staff. Some used words I would not repeat in a church. Some used words that made me want to sit down. One from a dispatcher named Ray said she had seen the headline and was bringing a basket of cookies to the night crew because she knew they would be tense. Her kindness made my chest ache in a new place. A senior editor from the Herald called Susan to confirm that they would run a second piece in the morning, print a longer layout with the law sidebar, and quotes from business analysts. Susan said fine. She asked them to keep the focus on the public record. They agreed. As the afternoon sloped toward evening, sunlight struck the windows in a way that made the city look like polished brass. David set his pen down and said we had done what we could on the media front. He said the rest would be noise and that we should let the story carry its own weight. He reminded me to save my voice for Avery. I stood and stretched my back and felt the pull of a long day along my spine. The room had emptied of its earlier rush and settled into that middle distance that offices find when the first crisis has been contained and the next has not yet arrived. I walked to the window and placed my hand against the glass. The heat outside bled through faint and steady, a reminder that the world did not care about our drama. Drivers were moving freight across I-20 and I-35 and down along 59 to the Gulf. The work kept going because that is what work does when people choose it. I turned from the window and found Robert watching me. He said it would be better to tell Avery myself before she read every line. He was right. I picked up my phone and stared at the dark screen for a long breath. Then I punched in her number and waited while it rang into the space between the life she thought she had and the one we were about to live. We agreed to meet at the Adolphus downtown. She said 30 minutes. By the time I pulled into the valet lane, the sun had leaned low and turned the windows to sheets of copper. I asked the desk for her room and was told she would meet me in a private sitting room off the mezzanine. Avery stood at the far window with her arms folded tight across her ribs. The dress from last night was gone. She wore dark jeans and a soft sweater, hair pulled back with the kind of haste that leaves a few strands free. She did not come to me. Her first words were sharp and they found their mark. Why did you never tell me about Meridian? Why did you let me believe the company would be mine for all these years? I told her the year and the numbers in the hospital hallways. I told her about the bank and the suits and the word covenants that kept me awake. I told her about Meridian and the bridge they built under us when the road washed out. I told her about 10% in board votes and the first time I learned to explain a decision instead of handing it down. I told her the thing that sat like a stone in my chest. I should have told you. I wanted a day that felt right and I kept waiting for it and it never arrived. He told me you were hiding things because you were slipping, she said. He said you forgot numbers and repeated yourself. He said you lost your keys twice in 1 week and could not remember where you parked outside your own office. He showed me a calendar with missed meetings circled in red. He showed me a video where you asked the same question to the same driver 2 days in a row. He sent me a link to a site about guardianship. He said we should think about an evaluation before something terrible happened. I let the words settle. They echoed things I had begun to notice in the looks of a few people around me in the last months. I asked her if she believed him. I did, she said. Not at first. Then he kept bringing evidence. I told myself stress could do strange things to a mind, and that love meant being brave enough to say hard things. I started a list of specialists. I saved a number for a lawyer who handles elder care. I hate saying that to you. I sat in the chair across from her and placed my hands on my knees to keep them still. I said that forgetting a meeting in a week like we had last quarter did not equal decline. I said the doctor who saw me 3 months ago said my blood work looked better than most men 10 years younger. I said I would take any evaluation she wanted. Today if it would help. Tomorrow if today was too much. I said none of that excused me from keeping the truth from her for too long. I watched her fight herself, and I wanted to stand but did not. She took a breath that shuddered. He said you were reckless, she whispered. He said he needed to step in before you lost everything. He said I would be the one left to pick up the pieces. I asked if he ever said he loved her during those speeches. He said the life we could build if he could unchain me from your mistakes. He said I did not owe my childhood to a company that made you miss recitals and anniversaries. He said a wife needed a husband who could give her a home that did not smell like diesel and ledger books. I told her he came to my office today and said a buyer was on the line for $45 million and that he would receive $500,000 for the introduction. He told me he was talking to a consultant, she said. He told me it was about positioning and brand. He said he would never do anything without speaking to me first. I opened the envelope and set the clinic photos on the table. She stared at the bruise without speaking. She looked at me instead. He said you hit him, she said. He told my friends I was in shock and misremembered the angle. He said in the video you shoved him first and the camera missed it. I shook my head once. I know, she said. I watched the other videos when they went live. I know what I saw. I also know what I wanted to believe yesterday afternoon. Those two things are not the same. I told her about Emily. I told her about the gambling slips and the private lender and the way he had used public scenes to push private outcomes. I told her about the voicemail where he recited the words competency and hearing like he had discovered the law 5 minutes earlier. I told her about the meeting he just left where he named his fee, the way a man names his price for moving furniture. She said she felt stupid. I told her she was not. I told her she was trusting. I said I had given him that knife by keeping her in the dark. I said I was sorry in a way that did not shift any blame onto her shoulders. Then something in her face softened. The hard lines around her mouth eased. She took one step, then another. She sat on the sofa next to my chair and leaned forward until her forehead touched my shoulder. Then all the sobs she had been holding since last night came in a rush. I put my arms around her and felt how thin she was under the sweater. I pressed my cheek to her hair and let her cry until the sound gentled and then faded. She said I wanted to defend him. I did. He is my husband, and I wanted to believe I had not made a mistake on this scale. I kept thinking if you would just let go of the company we could all breathe. I told her I could not fix her marriage for her. I told her I would not tell her what to do. I told her I would do everything to keep her safe and to keep the company from being used as a weapon against her. I said we had a meeting planned with counsel where Ethan would have a chance to describe his plan in his own words. I said all I needed from her was the truth as she knew it and a willingness to let the record carry the weight. She nodded. She asked if I would take the evaluation anyway. I said yes. Today and next month and next year if it helped her sleep. I said I was her father, and that job did not come with retirement. Avery reached for my hand and held it the way she used to when we crossed a street. She said she would move to a different room, not the one booked under his name. I said I would walk her to the desk. At the desk, she arranged a new key card. She said, "Good night, Dad." I let the lobby fall away behind me and crossed to the curb where Robert waited with the car idling. We drove in silence down to Louisiana Street and took the elevator to the floor where Meridian's outside counsel kept there. We reviewed the plan one more time. I would appear open to a transition. I would ask for assurances about Avery and the brand. I would let Ethan speak himself into the shape he had already traced. When he pressed for a signature, Robert would request a brief recess. Counsel would enter with the packet. The recorder would capture the words that mattered. Security notified us when Ethan stepped off the elevator. He entered like a guest of honor, blue suit. A smile tuned to the room and a folder under his arm that looked fat and triumphant. I let it hang and gestured to a chair. He said he appreciated my willingness to be pragmatic. He opened the folder and spread papers like a dealer laying down a run. Transfer of voting rights. Appointment of interim manager. Limited advisory role to be held by me. He slid a letter of intent forward and tapped the figure with one finger. He said $45 million again, slow and sweet, and added that he would receive a $500,000 fee at closing, a standard market practice for a man who could put the right parties in a room. He said the buyer valued our Gulf routes and cold chain assets and wanted speed. I let my hand rest on a pen but did not lift it. I asked what protections the drivers would have. He said market rates would be honored where practical. I asked about dispatch. He said efficiencies would be identified. I asked about our shops. He said consolidation was inevitable in any modern operation. I nodded as if I were weighing blessings. I said I needed to know Avery would be safe. I said any transition would require assurances that her name would not be used to shield liabilities. He said we could draft language right now. Robert cleared his throat and asked for a short pause to confirm formatting on the documents. Ethan waved a magnanimous hand and said, "Of course." One of the lawyers placed a slim recorder on the table and clicked it on. She confirmed the time and the participants for the record. She asked if there was any objection to recording. Ethan smiled and said none. David set a folder on the table and slid it toward the lawyers. They did not touch it yet. The first lawyer asked Ethan to confirm that he had proposed a sale of Coleman Freight Lines to the party named in the letter of intent. He said yes, and then he added that all sensible people knew this was the right exit. The second lawyer asked him to confirm that he would receive a fee from the buyer. He said yes again, and this time he added that $500,000 was frankly a discount given his role. The first lawyer opened the folder. Bank statements. Personal loans from a private lender in Conroe. Cash advances tied to cards used at a casino east of the state line. A printout of a voicemail transcript where Ethan had said I lost control and struck him. Ethan's jaw worked. He said the debts were temporary. He said the voicemail was taken out of context and that any reasonable listener would hear the full story. The second lawyer pressed play on a second clip. His words from our earlier meeting came back into the room. He had said bridge payment. He had said keep the buyer warm. He had said sign now and fix it later. He said this was an ambush. He said a father does not do this to family. He said a real man would not hide behind counsel. He said many things a man says when he feels the trap close. I stayed seated. I kept my voice level. I asked who his creditors were. He swallowed. He looked at the papers, then at the door, then at me. He said it was none of my concern, and then in the same breath said he needed control to clear them because they were calling every hour and would not wait through another quarter. The first lawyer asked him to repeat what he had just said so the record would be clear. He said he had misspoken. He said he was speaking hypothetically. He said any fees were contingent and unrelated to pressing obligations. Ethan stared at the image and then at my face. He said he regretted the scene. He said stress and champagne. He said we were men and could move past it. Susan spoke for the first time. She asked if he had told anyone he intended to seek a competency hearing. He puffed up and said he had considered all legal remedies. The second lawyer asked if he understood that any attempt to coerce a transfer with threats to reputation or false statements could be considered extortion. He said he did not accept the premise and shifted his eyes to me as if I might save him from the words in the room. I asked him why he thought I would ever sign a document in a room where he had spoken like this. He said because I loved Avery and because the deal would secure her future. I asked how selling the company to a rival that would close shops and consolidate routes served her future. He said risk reduction has a cost. He said the brand could survive better under a larger umbrella. He said I was being sentimental. The first lawyer closed the folder. She said the board would review everything with outside authorities. She said there would be no transfer of control. She said the company had filed for a temporary protective order concerning me and that further contact should be routed through counsel. She said the firm would be in touch regarding the preservation of communications and devices relevant to any dispute. He said this would look bad in print. He said investors hate gray hair. He said public opinion would turn if he told the full story. David said the meeting was concluded. He faced me. He said I would regret this. He said families do not forget. I stood slowly. I told him he was right about one thing. Families remember. He shook his head like I had missed the point and walked out with the folder hugged to his chest. The partners began to sort the records into stacks that could carry a case. David wrote a short list of next steps. Robert placed a hand on my shoulder and did not say anything for several seconds. We were not done. We had only moved the fight into daylight and onto paper where daylight belongs. I picked up the clinic envelope and the recorder and slipped both into my briefcase. I nodded to Robert and we walked toward the elevators without hurry. We stepped into the elevator and the doors slid shut on that paneled floor, and Robert said he would call the detective as soon as we hit the lobby. We crossed to the car and he put the phone on speaker so I could hear the steady voice on the other end. The detective said the affidavit was complete, the witness statements aligned, and the clinic photographs were clear. He said the district attorney had signed off and a judge had issued the warrant. He said they would serve it today if Ethan was still in our building. Meridian Security texted as if on cue. Ethan had returned to the 20th floor unannounced, asking to see me and anyone with signing authority. Susan sent a brief reply. Kindly ask him to wait in conference 3. We would be there shortly. We rode up together. Robert kept his voice even as he texted the detective our floor and the room. Ethan stood at the glass wall with downtown behind him. He smiled when he saw us. He said we needed to be men and find a way forward. He said I should signal to Susan that she could relax because he had eased their concerns. I told him we would wait for the rest of the team. He rolled his eyes and muttered something about theatrics. He started another call. Voice-low words clipped a list of instructions to someone I did not know. He said keep the bridge warm. He said have the fee letter ready. He said the old man would sign or the court would make him. 2 uniformed officers stepped out of the elevator with a plainclothes detective between them, a woman with her hair pulled back and a file in her hand. The lobby seemed to inhale. She walked directly to Ethan and asked for his name. He said it like a challenge. She read from the file, then looked up and said that by order of the state he was under arrest for assault on a person 65 or older, and for attempted fraud tied to an effort to coerce transfer of corporate control. She asked him to place his hands where she could see them. Ethan said this was a mistake. He said I had fallen and hit myself. He said business competition was not a crime. He pointed at me and said there were witnesses who would swear I had swung. The detective held his gaze without blinking, and Robert stepped forward with the red file that held the clinic report, the statements, and the transcripts. The detective did not look at the file. She asked again for his hands. He lifted them slowly. The officers, moved with practiced calm, turned him and set the cuffs. He flinched at the metal. He twisted his head to find my eyes and said he had done all of this for Avery and me. He said I would thank him one day when the pressure eased. I said nothing. Behind him, the elevator opened again, and Avery stepped out with Susan at her shoulder. She stopped when she saw the cuffs. She met his eyes only once and then looked at the detective. The detective spoke in a voice that was part kindness and part procedure. She said they would book him at Lou Sterrett, that he would see a magistrate, that counsel could meet him later. He began to talk over her voice rising, saying he had not hurt anyone, saying he had been provoked, saying that old men forget, and that he had stepped in to protect family assets. Susan directed staff to clear the corridor. Robert stood with his arms loosely at his sides, his face unreadable. Ethan tried one last angle. He said there were emails that proved I had intended to step down. He said I had told him to act if I hesitated. He said Avery had agreed that a competency evaluation was necessary. He said anyone would understand that decisive action was love in motion. Avery spoke, then her voice low but clear enough to carry. She said she had watched the videos. She said she had read the settlement from Tarrant County and the gambling losses and the notes from the private lender. She said love does not stage a spectacle to steal a signature. She said love does not slap a father and call it leadership. The detective nodded to the officers, and they began to walk him toward the elevators. He named a buyer in San Antonio as if the name were a shield. He said he had been forced to move fast because people were calling all day and all night, and they would not wait. The doors closed on him, and the noise bled away. I felt the energy leave my muscles in a slow tide. Susan touched Avery's elbow and asked if she wanted a chair. Robert spoke quietly. He said the booking would take an hour, that counsel would monitor arraignment and bail, that a no-contact order would be secured by nightfall. He said we should focus on operations for the next 2 days because customers read headlines and then checked tender screens for reasons to worry. He said we would give them none. Avery reached up and touched the edge of the bruise that still colored my cheek. She said she hated that it had come to this and that she hated more that it could have been worse if we had not acted. She said she would give a short statement through counsel saying she was safe and asking for privacy. She said she would go by the apartment with a friend to gather her things and that she did not want to speak to him. We moved into Conference 3 because that was where the day had steered us. Robert called the detective and confirmed delivery of the digital files. David coordinated with the communications team for a brief note to employees about the arrest. Susan took a call from a bank that wanted reassurance and gave it. I sat with my hands on the wood and listened to the room work. Security knocked and opened the door a few inches. They said there were 2 reporters downstairs and that they had been told to wait for counsel. They asked if anyone wanted to leave through the garage. Avery said she would use the garage and asked if I would walk her down. I said yes. In the elevator, she leaned her shoulder against mine in that small way daughters do when they want to claim space without asking for it. We rode in silence. We reached her car and she unlocked it with a click that sounded too loud. She turned to me and said she was all right. I stood there a moment after she drove away, hands in my pockets. When I went back upstairs, the hallway was quieter. Susan met me at the door to the conference room. She said the magistrate had scheduled the first appearance. She said the detective had asked us to prepare a fuller packet overnight in case additional charges were considered. She asked if I was ready to keep going. I said I was. We sat again and began the slow work that follows the sharp moment. Papers sorted into stacks, names entered into lists, calls made. Somewhere across town, a door closed on a cell and a man who had talked too much finally had to be quiet. Avery texted that she was safe at the hotel and that a friend was with her. She added, "I will not see him." I stared at that line and felt a strange mix of grief and gratitude. Robert saw the look on my face and nodded once without asking. The work picked up again. Not long after, the detective called to confirm the booking and the charges as recorded. When the call ended, the room was quiet except for the sound of pages turning. I looked at the photographs still peeking from the red file, then slid them away. I reached for a pen and began to make notes for the morning. Outside, the city kept breathing, indifferent and vast, while in one corner of it a small ring of people chose to hold a line and call that choice by its proper name. By spring of 2025, the hearings were old news and the newsroom glare had moved on to fresher fires. Inside our walls, the real story had been slow and exacting work. Contracts reviewed, roots tightened, trust practiced, one small decision at a time until it felt natural again. Meridian met us halfway. The closing was held in our conference room. Avery wired funds from a bank that had agreed to lend because numbers and character lined up in a row. When we finished, Meridian transferred 60% back to the family. What I felt was responsibility with a new steadiness. When they left, I walked my daughter to the window and we stood looking at the lanes of I-35 catching the light like a river. The board met that afternoon. The vote was short and clear. Avery was named chief executive. She looked down the table at men and women who had watched her grow and now at 33 in a Navy suit. She said what needed saying. Keep the wheels turning. Focus on safety. Tell the truth faster. She added a safety bonus that paid out quarterly based on clean inspections and incident-free miles. She put a nurse practitioner on a part-time contract to hold wellness days in each shop, so drivers could get basic checks without giving up a run. I became an advisor with an office down the hall. Drivers stopped in to tell me where loads were snagging. I listened and took notes and walked them to my daughter when they were ready for decisions. She would read and ask questions and say, "Show me where that process begins and who owns it." We set up grills behind the Beaumont shop and hauled in ice chests and rented a shade tent. Ray handed out paper plates. Avery moved through the crowd answering to her name. When I walked across that lot, I felt the old family of the place return, not as nostalgia, but as a fact. I lost years keeping this thing alive, and I would not trade the cost because now it belongs to family again. Ethan took a plea to a reduced count, the kind that spares the court a trial and spares no one. The label that follows a man into a background check. A judge issued a no-contact order that sits in a file and in my daughter's phone. The marriage ended on paper in a downtown courtroom. We won a modest contract with a regional grocer after a competitor failed a service audit. It was the kind that pays for new tires and a Christmas bonus. On a morning in November, we sat on the tailgate of the same old pickup I had once used as a moving desk at the hospital garage. She told me she had been afraid when she signed the loan papers. She told me she still wakes at 3 some nights to check the cash position in her head. She told me she has not felt alone once in those moments. I said that is what a company is when it is healthy. A set of hands you can count without seeing. December brought a letter from Meridian. It praised Avery by name for the decisions that steadied a fleet in a market that does not forgive sloppy work. And then it was February again, a full turn of the calendar. We held a small ceremony in the boardroom for new trainees, and I told them the short version of a long story. I told them a company is not a parking lot full of tractors or a column of numbers. It is the promises we keep when nobody is watching. It is the way we speak to each other in hallways when tempers are hot. It is the call you make when a load is late to tell the truth faster than the rumor can run. When they left the room, Avery stayed behind and sat in the chair at the head of the table. She asked if I ever missed the weight of that chair. I told her the truth. I carried it long enough. Now I carry something lighter and more important. I carry the pleasure of watching you do this job better than I did. I had kept the promise I made her mother in a hospital room. Take care of our girl. She has done the rest herself.